Dear students of class 8A and 8B, look at the board, chapter 4, topic United Nations, and the points as I mentioned in the board. As per the points, today I shall teach my lesson. First point, principal organs of the United Nations. Second point, special agencies of the United Nations. Third point, main aim of the United Nations. Fourth point, achievements of the United Nations. Some achievements are there. I have done a sketch of it. Number 1, intervention of the United Nations. Second, issue in Egypt. Third, issue in Soviet Russia. Fourth, efforts of the United Nations. Fifth, protest against the racial policy of protest against the policy of racial discrimination. And last one, issue of Iran and Iraq war. The first point, principal organs. The first point, principal organs of the United Nations. Principal organs of the United Nations. Which are the principal organs of the United Nations? You know, there are 6 principal organs of the United Nations, namely General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council, Secretariat, and the International Court of Justice. These are the six major organs of the United Nations, or principal organs of the United Nations. And next point, special agencies of the United Nations. Special agencies of the United Nations. What are the special agencies of the United Nations? There are 3 special agencies of the United Nations, such as UNESCO, UNICEF, and WHO. What is the full form of UNESCO? The full form of UNESCO is United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And what is the full form of UNICEF? The full form of UNICEF is United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. And what is the full form of WHO or WHO? The full form of WHO is World Health Organization. So these are the 3 specialized agencies of the United Nations. Next point, main aim of the United Nations. What is the main aim of the United Nations? The main aim of the United Nations is to save the coming generations from the surge of war and ensure peace in the world. This is the main aim of the United Nations. And next point, achievements of the United Nations. What are the achievements of the United Nations? There are so many achievements of the United Nations. Out of it, some achievements I am going to discuss. The first one, intervention of the United Nations. Intervention of the United Nations. Intervention of the United Nations. You know, the United Nations forced Britain and France to withdraw its troops from no, this is not that point. Intervention of the United Nations means United Nations intervened among nations in order to stop war in order to stop wars in the world. That means United Nations organizations under his intervention, many wars of nations brought to an end under the intervention of the United Nations. Many wars among nations brought to an end under the intervention of the United Nations. Next point, issue of Egypt. Issue in Egypt. Two countries of Europe, Britain and France. Britain and France attacked Egypt, and for that reason they sent troops in Egypt. But the United Nations forced these two countries, Britain and France, to withdraw its troops from Egypt. And third one, issue in Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia, in order to crush the popular uprising of the Hungarians, sent many troops in Hungary. But it is due to the effort of the United Nations, Soviet Russia was forced to withdraw its troops from Hungary. Hungary was a place beside Soviet Russia, and many Russians were there. They started popular uprising against the Russian government. The Russian government sent a large number of troops in order to crush their movement, but it is due to the effort of United Nations, Soviet Russia was forced to withdraw its troops from Hungary under the intervention of the United Nations. The next one, efforts of the United Nations. What efforts are done by the United Nations? The United Nations condemned or protested. The United Nations, there are some countries of the world like Indonesia, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. These were the countries, and few more countries of the world, they have owned their independence under the intervention of the United Nations. Under the approval, under the intervention of the United Nations organization, some countries of the world, they have owned their independence like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Indonesia, and some other countries of the world. They have owned their independence under the intervention of the United Nations. And next one, protest against the policy of racial discrimination. Protest against the policy of racial discrimination. It is due to an effort of the United Nations organization. The United Nations organization condemned against the policy of racial discrimination of South Africa. The South African government was following a policy of racial discrimination. They adopted the policy of racial discrimination, and hence the United Nations organization, they condemned the policy of South African government. They condemned the policy of racial discrimination there in South Africa, and under the intervention of the United Nations organization, the racial policy or the policy of racial discrimination in South Africa continued till the year 1990s. But till it ended in the year 1990s, the United Nations organizations kept on continuing protesting and condemning the policy of policy of racial discrimination of South Africa. And next point, issue of Iran and Iraq war. Issue of Iran and Iraq war. The two Arabian countries, no, Far East, not the Far East two countries. In the Far East two countries, Iraq and Iran, they fought against each other. They fought against each other, and it was nothing but a tug of war between themselves on the question of their policies. In policy making, they protested against each other, and hence there was a long 8-year war between Iraq and Iran. This long year war between these two countries, Iraq and Iran, United Nations Organization brought about a ceasefire in the 8-year long year between Iraq and Iran. And another thing is that besides these, these points, more other achievements also were there with the United Nations organizations. The United Nations organization achieved more by performing well in making the world free of tension, political tension, free of any international misunderstanding. That's why the United Nations imposed restrictions on some countries of the world, like Indonesia, like Somalia and Yugoslavia. Besides, United Nations organizations brought about a check in the arms race competition among different nations. Arms race competition. It brought about a check in the arms race competitions among the nations of the world, and also it also encourages atomic energy to be used in peaceful purposes. It encourages different nations of the world to use atomic energy for peaceful purposes. Another important achievement of the United Nations is it has checked the possibility of the Third World War. There was a possibility of Third World War after the Second World War, or at the end of the Second World War. There was a possibility of starting another World War, but under the programs of the United Nations, the United Nations organization is able to prevent the outbreak of a Third World War. It is one of the most important achievements of the United Nations. Another achievement of the United Nations is it has been trying hard to bring about a check in the arms among the nations, and also is encouraging the nations to use atomic energy for the peaceful purposes. Besides, in the social, political, economic, cultural and educational fields, the United Nations has done extremely well through its major agencies like UNESCO, UNICEF, and WHO or WHO. It has been doing well only because of the contributions of three major agencies: UNESCO, UNICEF, and WHO. So, in the field of social development, in the field of political, economic, cultural, and scientific upliftment, the United Nations has done extremely well only because of its specialized agencies like UNESCO, UNICEF, and WHO. And besides, the United Nations organizations is determined to make the world free of all kinds of misunderstanding, free of political tensions, and for that reason, this organ has done extremely well for the purpose of saving the world free of political tension and wars. Besides, United Nations was formed after the Second World War, United Nations organization was established after the Second World War in order to establish peace, in order to check arms race, in order to avoid political tensions, And for that reason, the two countries, France and Britain, played a vital role, and they signed in the Charter Act of 1941. Only two countries of Europe signed in the Charter. Which Charter? The Charter which was signed by the two countries in the year 1941. The name of the Charter was Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter in August 1941 had become a symbol of peace, solidarity, cooperation, and brotherhood. For that reason, the United Nations, the works and the programs of the United Nations organizations had become very easier because all the member states took an oath to establish permanent solution of all international disputes and crises by means of their joint efforts. And ultimately, there was none to raise hue and cry against the decisions of the United Nations, because the world witnessed major defects in the structure of the organization, the League of Nations. The League of Nations also was established as international political organization, but it also had its own aim and objectives. What was its own and objectives? When the First World War was going on, the League of Nations was established to stop possibilities of the Second World War, but it failed. It failed to stop the possibility. It failed to stop another World War, the Second World War. Ultimately, the Second World War took place in spite of being an international political organization, the League of Nations. And as a result of it, the League of Nations had no importance, and the Second World War took place. The League of Nations members failed to shoulder responsibilities for making the world free of political tensions, but it is due to the drawbacks, shortcomings of the League of Nations. The Second World War took place, and at the end of the Second World War, another political international political organization was established under the special care of the two countries of Europe, France and Britain. They signed the Atlantic Charter in the year 1941 when the Second World War was going on. Right that moment, these two countries of Europe, France and Britain, signed the Charter, Atlantic Charter, in the year August 19, in the month of August in the year 1941. And under the terms of the Atlantic Charter, the United Nations organization was established at the end of the Second World War in the year 1945. But more important countries also joined them. In the beginning, when the League of Nations was established, America did not interested to be a member of the League of Nations. It was a great drawback of the League of Nations. The other countries also were inspired by the policy of the America. Hence, they had no interest to be a member of the League of Nations. But from the very, very beginning, under the special care of the two countries, France and Britain, America became the member of the League of Nations. It is due to the effort of American President, it was due to the efforts of American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It is due to the special care of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Both the two countries signed the Atlantic Charter in the year 1941. Both the two countries, US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on behalf of America and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill on behalf of Britain, signed the Atlantic Charter in August 1941, and according to which the United Nations organizations, UNO, was established at the end of the Second World War. And it is due to that reasons the United Nations also took an oath to save the coming generations from the scourge of the war and ensure peace throughout the whole world. And as a result of it, the United Nations organizations achieved achieved this success, and these achievements made the United Nations a symbol of harmony, peace, solidarity, brotherhood, and international understanding for all nations of the world. Up to this, my dear students, thank you.